The night of December 15, 1993, started like any other winter shift for firefighter David Park at Station 23 in downtown Seattle. He sat at the warm kitchen table, sharing jokes with his crew while steam rose from his third cup of coffee. The usual sounds of the city drifted through the station's windows, cars honking, the distant rumble of the late-night train, and the gentle patter of rain that had been falling all day. At exactly 11:42 p.m., the station's alarm pierced through their laughter. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the speaker. Structure fire reported at Pine Street Apartments, 1420 Pine Street. Multiple residents trapped. David's heart jumped into his throat as he and his team rushed to gear up. He knew that building. It was one of the oldest structures in the area, home to many young families and elderly residents. Within 3 minutes, they arrived at the scene. The sight made David's blood run cold. Flames had already engulfed the 4th and 5th floors of the 8-story building, and thick black smoke poured from several windows. People in pajamas huddled on the sidewalk, some crying, others shouting about family members still inside. The winter air was sharp with the smell of burning wood and plastic. Captain Rodriguez quickly organized the response. "Park, take Johnson and secure the west stairwell. We need to clear floors 3 through 5. David nodded, his training kicking in as he adjusted his oxygen mask. The heat hit him like a wall as they entered the building. Their powerful flashlights cut through the smoke, revealing walls already crackling with flames. They worked methodically, checking each apartment, marking cleared units with fluorescent X's. The smoke grew thicker as they climbed, and the roar of the fire became deafening. On the 5th floor, they heard it, a sound that made them freeze. Through the chaos of crackling flames and groaning structure, a child's cry echoed faintly. "Captain, we've got possible victims on 5. David called into his radio. Static crackled back. "Park, that floor's about to go. Get out now. We'll send a team up the aerial ladder." But David couldn't move. The cry came again, clearer this time. 2 voices. Children. His own kids were about the same age, safely tucked in bed at home. These children didn't have that luxury right now. Without hesitation, he turned to Johnson. "Tell the captain I heard wrong. I'm going in." Johnson grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, man. The floor's not stable." "Then I better be quick," David replied, already moving down the smoke-filled hallway. The heat was intense now, his protective gear approaching its limits. He counted doors. 503, 504, 505. The cries grew louder. Outside, he could hear the aerial ladder being positioned, but he knew it would take too long. At apartment 507, he found the door hot to the touch. Using his Halligan tool, he breached it in 3 powerful strikes. The apartment's living room was already fully involved, flames climbing the walls like living things. He dropped to his knees, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke. "Fire department, call out." His voice boomed through the apartment. The response was immediate, terrified cries from somewhere ahead. Following the sound, he pushed through to a small bedroom. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his own hands, but there in the corner, he made out 2 small figures huddled together in a closet. They were tiny, probably no more than 2 years old, clutching each other in matching blue pajamas. Their faces were streaked with soot, eyes wide with terror. David's heart nearly stopped. They were the same age as his own twins at home. "Hey there," he said softly, pulling off his mask. "Let's get you out of here." The building groaned ominously above them. No time for gentle coaxing. He scooped both children into his arms, securing them against his chest. They clung to him like coilers, their small bodies shaking. The return journey was a nightmare. The hallway had become an inferno, and David could feel the floor shifting beneath his boots. His lungs burned as he tried to share his oxygen with the kids, pressing the mask against their faces every few steps. The building was falling apart around them, with chunks of ceiling crashing down and flames reaching out like hungry hands. When they reached the stairwell, he found it blocked by fallen debris. The only option was the fire escape. Through the window, he could see it was partially melted from the heat, but it was their only chance. Cradling the children closer, he kicked out the window. The bitter December air hit them like a slap. David stepped onto the fire escape, testing each step. 5 floors up, the metal groaned under their weight. Halfway down, the unthinkable happened. With a screech of protesting metal, the structure began to pull away from the building. David didn't think. He jumped for the next landing, his body curled around the children. They landed hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but he held on. Somehow, through sheer determination and maybe a bit of divine intervention, they made it to the ground. As soon as his feet touched the pavement, the world erupted in activity. Paramedics rushed forward, taking the children from his arms. His colleagues surrounded him, voices full of disbelief and relief. But David's eyes stayed on the twins, watching as oxygen masks were placed over their tiny faces. They reached for each other across the space between gurneys, their small hands clasping tightly. Only then did the pain hit him. The skin on his back and arms felt like it was on fire. As the adrenaline faded, he realized how close they'd all come to disaster. But looking at those two little survivors, he knew he'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. That night changed everything, for the twins, for David, for everyone who witnessed it. None of them could have known then that this was just the beginning of a story that would span 3 decades, or that fate had plans that would bring them full circle in the most unexpected ways. Time seemed to slow down in those crucial moments after David found the twins. The heat inside apartment 507 was becoming unbearable, even through his protective gear. Sweat ran down his face in rivers, stinging his eyes as he assessed the situation. The 2 small children, barely toddlers, looked up at him with complete trust in their eyes, their little hands gripping each other tightly as if they'd never let go. The smoke was getting thicker by the second, rolling across the ceiling in dark waves. David could hear the building groaning around them, a sound every firefighter dreads. It meant the structure was failing. They had minutes, maybe less. His radio crackled with urgent voices calling him to evacuate, but the children's safety was all that mattered now. He quickly checked the twins for injuries, his trained eyes scanning their small bodies. Their pajamas were covered in soot, but underneath, they seemed physically unharmed. The little boy had a small stuffed elephant clutched in one hand, while his sister held onto a worn blanket. These simple comforts had probably helped them stay calm in the chaos. Making a swift decision, David unzipped his heavy fire jacket. The blast of heat against his undershirt was immediate, but he didn't hesitate. He wrapped both children in the protective gear, creating a makeshift cocoon. The jacket was designed to withstand extreme temperatures. It would shield them from the worst of what was to come. "Okay, little ones," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "We're going on an adventure. I need you to hold on to each other and stay very still, like sleeping koalas. Can you do that for me?" The twins nodded, their faces serious beyond their years. The little girl reached out and grabbed her brother's hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. David secured them against his chest, one arm holding them firmly while keeping his other hand free. His mind raced through evacuation routes. The main stairwell was completely engulfed now. He could hear the roar of the flames through the walls. The building's fire escape was their only option, despite its questionable condition. As they moved through the apartment, David kept talking softly to the twins, partly to keep them calm and partly to help himself stay focused through the growing pain of the heat against his now unprotected skin. "You're doing great, just like little superheroes. We're almost there." The window leading to the fire escape was stuck, warped by the heat. David had to ram it with his shoulder 3 times before it burst open, letting in a rush of bitterly cold December air. The temperature change was so sudden it made the twins gasp. Their breath came out in little white puffs in the winter night. The fire escape platform was slick with ice and water from the fire hoses below. David tested it with one foot, feeling the metal groan ominously. Looking down, he could see his fellow firefighters positioning themselves below, their faces turned upward in concern. The aerial ladder was still trying to reach their position, but the narrow alley made it difficult to maneuver. That's when he heard it, the horrible screeching sound of metal failing. The fire escape shuddered beneath them. Without thinking, David tightened his grip on the twins and began to move faster than was safe on the icy steps. His boots slipped and slid, but he kept his balance through sheer determination. They were halfway down when the entire structure gave a violent lurch. The twins whimpered but stayed perfectly still just as he'd asked. David could feel the heat of the fire through the soles of his boots now. The metal was literally melting beneath them. 3 floors up, the sections they'd just descended pulled away from the building with a thunderous crack. Time for careful steps was over. David looked down, judging the distance to the next landing. It was a risk, but staying put was certain death. He pulled the children tighter against his chest, wrapped both arms around them, and jumped. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through his legs, but he managed to stay upright. The last 2 floors were a blow of adrenaline and instinct. Later, David would have trouble remembering exactly how they made it down. His back and arms were on fire, not from flames, but from severe burns where his protective gear should have been. None of that mattered. All that mattered was getting these 2 precious lives to safety. When they finally reached the ground, David's legs gave out. He sank to his knees, still cradling the twins. Immediately, his fellow firefighters swarmed around them. Gentle hands tried to take the children, but they clung to David, their little fingers gripping his undershirt. It took several minutes of soft coaxing before they would let go. The paramedics worked quickly, checking vitals and placing oxygen masks over their tiny faces. Despite being separated onto different gurneys, the twins reached for each other across the gap, their hands finding each other as if guided by an invisible force. Their eyes never left each other, communicating in that silent way that only twins seem to have. David watched them, fighting to stay conscious as the pain from his burns became overwhelming. His gear had protected the children perfectly. They had nothing worse than slight smoke inhalation, but his exposed skin had paid the price. 2nd and 3rd degree burns covered his back, arms, and parts of his chest. As they loaded him into a separate ambulance, David caught one last glimpse of the twins. They were still holding hands between the gurneys, their small faces peaceful now that they were together and safe. Something told him their story wasn't over, it was just beginning. He couldn't have known then how right he was, or that 30 years later, their paths would cross again in the most remarkable way. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of his captain's voice. "You broke every protocol in the book, Park, and you saved their lives. Get some rest, hero." Then the darkness took him, and the first chapter of their incredible story came to a close. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital's burn unit cast long shadows across David's room. 3 days had passed since the rescue, and every hour felt like a lifetime. The doctors had told him he was lucky. The burns covered 30% of his body, but they would heal with time and proper care. The physical pain, though intense, wasn't what kept him awake at night. It was the constant wondering about those 2 little ones he'd carried from the flames. From his hospital bed, David pieced together what had happened that night through conversations with visiting colleagues and news reports on the small TV mounted in the corner. The fire had started due to faulty Christmas lights in a 3rd-floor apartment, spreading rapidly through the old building's ventilation system. 16 families had lost their homes, and the twins, they had lost everything. Their parents hadn't made it out. The news hit David like a physical blow when his captain visited, bringing coffee and the full report. Their father had tried to reach the children's room, but was overcome by smoke. Their mother was found near the apartment door, just steps away from potential safety. The guilt of surviving when their parents hadn't weighed heavily on David's heart, even though logically he knew there was nothing more he could have done. The twins were recovering well in the children's ward 2 floors below. Their names were Andy and Amy, both just shy of their 3rd birthday. The nurses told David they were inseparable, crying inconsolably whenever the hospital staff tried to put them in different rooms. Eventually, the staff gave up and pushed their small beds together, where they would sleep holding hands, finding comfort in each other's presence. David tried to visit them whenever he could manage the painful walk downstairs. His wife, June, would help him shuffle down the hallway, pulling his IV stand alongside. The twins' faces would light up every time they saw him, and for a few precious moments, the pain of his burns would fade away. They didn't speak much. Trauma had temporarily stolen their words, but their eyes said everything. They would reach for him with their small hands, and David would sit between their beds, telling them stories about brave knights and magical dragons until they fell asleep. But life has a way of moving forward, whether we're ready or not. As December turned to January, the reality of their situation became clear. The twins had no living relatives. Their mother had been an only child, and their father's family was all back in his home country, unable to take on the responsibility of raising 2 young children. The social workers started talking about foster care, and David felt his heart breaking all over again. He fought against it as hard as he could. In his mind, he had already started thinking of Andy and Amy as his own. June felt the same way. She had fallen in love with the twins during their hospital visits. They talked long into the night about taking them in themselves, but the timing couldn't have been worse. David's injuries meant he would never return to firefighting. Months of physical therapy lay ahead, and their savings would be stretched thin during his recovery. The day the social workers came to take the twins was the hardest. David sat in his wheelchair, still weak from his latest skin graft surgery, watching as the children were led away. They looked back at him with such trust, such certainty that he would follow. Annie waved her little hand, still clutching the stuffed elephant that had survived the fire. Andy held tight to his sister's other hand, his face brave but his lip trembling. "I'll find you," David whispered, though they were too far away to hear. "I promise I'll find you again." The next few months passed in a blur of pain, both physical and emotional. David threw himself into his recovery, pushing through physical therapy with grim determination. June took extra shifts at her teaching job to help with the mounting medical bills. Their lives changed completely. David had to reinvent himself, learning to use his experience in a different way. He became a fire safety consultant, teaching businesses and schools how to prevent tragedies like the one that had taken the twins' parents. He tried to keep track of the children through the system, but it wasn't easy. Privacy laws meant he could only get limited information. He knew they were still in Seattle, bouncing between foster homes. Every Christmas, he and June would send cards through the social services office, never sure if they reached their destination. They included photos of themselves, their phone number, their address, anything to maintain a connection. But as the years passed, the information became harder to get. The twins were moved to different homes, then different districts. The social workers changed, files were transferred, and eventually the trail went cold. David and June had to move to Portland for work, making it even harder to keep track of two children in an overwhelmed system. Still, David never gave up hope. He kept a special box in his home office, filled with newspaper clippings about the fire, photos from the hospital, and every bit of information he had about the twins. Sometimes, late at night, he would open it and look through the contents, wondering where they were, if they were happy, if they still remembered him. He didn't know then that fate had a plan. That 30 years later, his phone would ring with a call that would change everything. He couldn't have guessed that those two tiny children he'd carried from the flames would grow up to become remarkable adults who never stopped searching for their hero. But that's the thing about life. Sometimes the best stories take decades to unfold, and the most important promises find a way to be kept, no matter how long it takes. The first time the foster system tried to separate Andy and Amy, they were 7 years old. The social worker had explained in a gentle voice that the Thompson family could only take one child, but the twins simply couldn't understand why anyone would want to break them apart. They sat on their small beds in the group home, hands clasped tightly together, refusing to let go. "We stay together," Andy had said firmly, his young voice carrying a determination far beyond his years. Amy nodded beside him, her stuffed elephant, now worn and patched, clutched to her chest with her free hand. That elephant and Andy's baby blanket were their only possessions from their life before the fire, precious links to parents they could barely remember. The system tried 3 more times to place them separately before finally understanding. These siblings were a package deal. Their bond went beyond ordinary brotherhood and sisterhood. They had shared the experience of survival, of loss, of being saved by a brave firefighter whose face had become a distant but cherished memory. Their childhood became a patchwork of different homes, some better than others. The Wilsons kept them for almost 2 years, teaching them to garden and bake cookies. The Patels showed them how to play chess and helped them excel in math. The Hendersons had a house full of books that fed their growing minds. Each family added something to who they would become, like pieces of a complex puzzle slowly coming together. Through it all, they kept their own little traditions alive. Every December 15th, they would sit together, no matter where they were, and tell each other the story of the night they were saved. Each year, they remembered different details, the warmth of their rescuer's voice, the way he had wrapped them in his jacket, how he had called them his little superheroes. They didn't know his first name anymore, just that his last name was Park, and that he had risked everything to save them. School became their sanctuary. Andy discovered he had a natural talent for computers, spending hours in the library teaching himself programming. Amy found her voice through writing, filling notebooks with stories about brave heroes and daring rescues. Their teachers noticed their potential and encouraged them, writing glowing recommendations that would later help them secure scholarships. The hardest day of their lives came when they were 14. Their current foster family was moving to another state, and despite their best efforts, no local family could take both teenagers. The social workers had run out of options. For the first time since that terrible night of the fire, Andy and Amy would have to live apart. "It's only temporary," Amy said through her tears, hugging her brother tight. "We'll call every day. We'll write letters. We'll never really be apart." Andy couldn't speak, but he nodded, clutching his sister as if he could stop time just by holding on. They kept their promise. Every morning began with a phone call. Every evening ended with long text conversations. They shared everything. Andy's first computer build, Amy's first published story in the school newspaper, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. When one struggled, the other always seemed to know, even before the phone rang. Their separate foster families supported their bond, arranging weekend visits and joint holiday celebrations. Amy's foster mom, Mrs. Chen, would drive 2 hours each way to pick up Andy for their birthday weekends. Andy's foster dad, Mr. Reynolds, taught both twins to drive, treating them equally as his own. As they grew older, their shared experience of loss shaped them in different but complementary ways. Andy became the protector, the problem solver, channeling his energy into creating emergency response software that could help save other families from tragedy. Amy became the storyteller, the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, writing powerful pieces about foster care and family bonds. Their high school graduations fell on the same day, at different schools 40 miles apart. They each saved a seat in the audience for the other, knowing it would stay empty but needing that symbolic presence. That evening, they met halfway between their homes, sitting in a small diner until midnight, planning their futures. "We need to find him," Amy said, stirring her milkshake with a straw. "Firefighter Park. He's out there somewhere." Andy nodded, pulling out his laptop right there in the diner. "I've been working on a database search program. We'll find him, sis. We just need to be patient." College took them to different cities, but they chose schools within driving distance of each other. Every other weekend, one would make the journey to visit the other. Their dorm rooms had matching corkboards, covered with the same photos, their biological parents smiling at a picnic, their various foster families, and most importantly, a newspaper clipping about the fire that had changed their lives. They never stopped searching for their hero. Every December 15th, they would try a new approach. Andy would hack into old fire department records, while Amy would contact local newspapers for their archives. They knew he had been badly burned, that he had left firefighting, that his last name was Park. But Seattle was a big city, and people move on. Still, they never gave up hope. Through relationships, career changes, and life's ups and downs, their bond remained unshakable. They had learned early that family isn't always about blood. It's about the connections you fight to keep, the promises you choose to honor, the love that survives against all odds. As their 30th birthday approached, neither twin knew that their years of searching were about to pay off. They couldn't have guessed that a simple database upgrade at the Seattle Fire Department would finally unlock the information they had been seeking for so long. They didn't know that their hero had been looking for them too, keeping his own box of memories, holding on to his own hope of reunion. Sometimes the best stories take time to unfold, and the most important connections find their way back to us when we least expect it. Andy and Amy had grown up apart, but they had never truly been separated. Their journey was about to come full circle in ways that would prove that some bonds, whether formed in a moment of crisis or built over years of shared experience, are simply meant to last forever. The coffee shop was quiet that Sunday morning when Amy sat down to write her latest article. Her laptop screen glowed with an empty document, cursor blinking expectantly. As a journalist for the Pacific Northwest Times, she had written countless stories about other people's lives, but today was different. Today, she was finally writing their own story. Her phone buzzed. Andy's face appeared on the screen, as if he knew she was thinking about him. "You'll never believe what I found." His excited voice came through before she could even say hello. After 15 years of developing emergency response software, Andy had connections throughout the fire department's IT system. They're digitizing all their old personnel records. Everything from the Nennetys is going online. Emmy's heart skipped a beat. She had been working on a documentary about foster care experiences, but deep down, she knew it was really about finding their hero. Every interview, every piece of research had led her closer to understanding that night in December 1993. "Send me everything you can," she said, already closing her half-written article. Back in her small home office, Emmy spread out all their collected evidence. The yellowed newspaper clipping from the fire, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. A photocopy of their hospital records, noting rescue by FFD Park. A grey photo from a department newsletter showing their hero receiving a commendation before his injuries forced retirement. Andy had sent over dozens of digital files, personnel records, incident reports, medical leave documents. They had tried this kind of search before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was because they were both finally settled in their careers, or because 30 years felt like the right time for closure. Or maybe the universe was finally ready to bring their story full circle. Hours turned into days as they dug deeper. Emmy took a week off from work, telling her editor she was researching a special feature. In reality, she barely left her desk, following every possible lead. Andy wrote new data mining programs specifically for this search, letting them run day and night on his powerful home computer. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While interviewing a retired nurse for her documentary, Emmy mentioned the burn unit at Seattle General. The nurse's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, the twin rescue. I remember that firefighter, such a kind man. His wife was a teacher, brought books to read to you two every day." A wife who was a teacher. It was a new piece of information. Andy fed this detail into his search algorithms, cross-referencing educational records from the 90s. The computer hummed through the night, sorting through thousands of employment records. At 3 a.m, Amy's phone rang. "I found a June Park." Andy's voice was trembling with excitement. She taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary until 2010. Then she and her husband moved to Portland. "Amy, they've been in Portland for the last 13 years. Amy nearly dropped her phone. Portland was just a few hours away. They had been so close all this time, practically neighbors. Her hands shook as she opened her laptop, searching Portland's business directories. And there it was, David Park, fire safety consultant. A small company website showed a familiar face, older but with the same kind eyes she remembered from her childhood. The next few days were a blur of activity. They needed to be certain before making contact. Andy took time off work, flying in from Seattle to help with the final verification. They dug through property records, business licenses, old school newsletters, anything to confirm this was really their hero. Every new detail made the picture clearer. David Park had left firefighting after serious injuries from a rescue involving 2 children. He and his wife had tried to adopt the children but couldn't due to his recovery and financial situation. They had moved to Portland for a fresh start, where he had built a successful consulting business teaching others about fire safety. "Look at this," Emmy whispered one evening, showing Andy a local news article from 2015. It was about David's fire safety program in Portland schools. The reporter had asked him what inspired his dedication to teaching children about fire prevention. His response made both twins tear up. "I once saved 2 young children from a fire. I've always wondered what happened to them, hoped they grew up safe and happy. Everything I do is to prevent other families from going through what their family did." The final piece fell into place when they found a recent photo of David at a fire safety convention. He was standing in front of a display board, and there, pinned in the corner, was a faded newspaper clipping, the same one Amy and Andy had treasured all these years. "It's time," Andy said softly, looking at his sister. They had spent so many years wondering, searching, hoping. Now that the moment was finally here, it felt almost surreal. Amy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They decided to write a letter first, wanting to be respectful of the life he had built. Amy spent hours drafting and redrafting, trying to find the right words to thank someone for saving your life. How do you tell someone that you've held them in your heart for 30 years? That their courage didn't just save 2 children, it inspired them to build lives dedicated to helping others. As Amy slipped the letter into the mailbox, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Whatever happened next, they had found him. Their hero had never forgotten them, just as they had never forgotten him. Their paths had been running parallel all these years, and now finally they were about to intersect again. They didn't know then that David still kept their hospital photos in his office, or that he and June still marked December 15th every year with quiet remembrance. They couldn't have guessed that their letter would arrive on the very day David was considering retirement, providing an answer to his unspoken questions about his life's purpose. The search was ending, but in many ways, their real story was just beginning. Sometimes the most important journeys aren't about finding someone who was lost, but about discovering that they were connected to you all along, waiting for the right moment to complete the circle that began on a cold December night so many years ago. The Seattle Fire Safety Convention Center buzzed with activity that spring morning. David Park stood at his company's booth, arranging pamphlets about home fire prevention. His hands, still bearing the faint scars from that night 30 years ago, moved automatically while his mind wandered. The letter in his jacket pocket seemed to weigh 100 pounds. He had read it at least 50 times since it arrived 2 weeks ago. The carefully written words had brought him to tears. Dear Mr. Park, you may not remember us, but 30 years ago you carried 2 small children from a burning building. His wife June had found him sitting in his office that evening, the letter clutched in trembling hands. Today was the day. The twins had asked to meet him here, at the very convention where he'd been displaying their newspaper clipping all these years. They chose this place because they knew he'd be comfortable here, surrounded by the work that had become his life's mission after leaving firefighting. Nervous? June appeared beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. She had taken the day off from her volunteer work at the library to be here. After retiring from teaching, she'd never lost her love of helping children learn. They'll be here any minute. David checked his watch for the 100th time. 10:57 a.m. They had said they would come at 11 o'clock. His heart was beating so fast he could barely stand still. What if they're disappointed? He whispered to June. What if I'm not what they remembered? June squeezed his hand. You're exactly what they remembered, the man who risked everything to save them. Nothing else matters. The convention center doors opened, and David's breath caught in his throat. A man and woman walked in together, both in their early 30s. Even from a distance, he knew it was them. They had the same way of moving in sync, the same watchful awareness of each other that he remembered from the hospital. Amy still carried herself with that quiet determination he remembered, though now she wore a press badge from a major newspaper. Andy had grown into his protective nature, his software company logo visible on his laptop bag. They paused at the entrance, scanning the room, and David felt frozen in place. Then Amy saw him. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears sprang to her eyes. Andy gripped his sister's shoulder, his own eyes bright with emotion. For a moment, no one moved. 30 years of searching, hoping, and wondering crystallized into this single moment. Amy moved first, walking quickly toward him with Andy right beside her. David took one step forward, then another. And suddenly they were there, standing face to face, 3 people connected by a single night that had changed all their lives forever. You still have the same kind eyes, Amy said softly, her voice breaking. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn stuffed elephant, the same one she had clutched that night in the fire. Andy unfolded a faded baby blanket from his messenger bag. David's vision blurred with tears. You kept them, he whispered. Without another word, Amy stepped forward and hugged him. Andy joined them, and David found himself holding the twins again, just like he had 30 years ago. Only this time, there was no fire, no danger, just the warmth of a family finally reunited. June watched from a few steps away, wiping her own tears. When the trio finally separated, she stepped forward to introduce herself. I used to read to you in the hospital, she said. Amy's eyes lit up with recognition. The lady with the storybooks. I remembered your voice, but I could never quite place it. They found a quiet corner of the convention center, away from the crowds. For hours, they shared their stories. David learned about their lives in foster care, their determination to stay together, their successful careers. The twins heard about his recovery, his move to Portland, his mission to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. "We tried to adopt you," David confessed, the words he'd held onto for 30 years finally spilling out. "But with my injuries, the medical bills, they said we weren't in a position to take on 2 children." "We know," Andy said gently. "We found the application in the old records. It meant everything to us to learn that you had tried." Amy pulled out a laptop, opening a document. "I'm writing a documentary about foster care experiences," she explained. "But really it's about you, about how one person's courage can change lives forever. Would you be willing to share your story?" David looked at these remarkable adults who had once been the tiny children he carried from the flames. "Our story," he corrected softly. "It's our story." They talked about everything and nothing. June shared photos she had taken in the hospital, pictures the twins had never seen before. Andy showed them his emergency response software, inspired by that night. Andy read them excerpts from her articles about community heroes. As the afternoon light began to fade, Amy suddenly laughed. "Do you know what's funny? We've been living just 3 blocks apart in Portland for the past 5 years. I get my coffee every morning at that little shop on Pine Street." "The one with the blue awning?" David asked in disbelief. "June and I go there every Sunday." All this time, Andy shook his head, smiling. "We were so close." Before they left, David showed them something he'd been saving. From his wallet, he pulled out a small, laminated photo, 2 small children in hospital beds, holding hands between them. "I've carried this every day for 30 years, he said, "to remind me why I do what I do." Amy and Andy each hugged him again, holding on as if making up for 30 years of missed embraces. They made plans for dinner the next evening. June insisted on cooking for them at their home. As they walked toward the exit, David called after them. "Wait," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just need to know, did you have good lives? Were you happy?" The twins looked at each other, then back at him. "We had each other," Amy said simply. "And we had the memory of you, teaching us that real heroes exist." That was enough. As they left the convention center that evening, all 4 of them knew that this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Sometimes the best families are the ones we find along the way, brought together not by blood, but by courage, sacrifice, and love that spans decades. David watched them walk away, his heart fuller than he could have imagined. June slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. After 30 years, the circle was complete. The little superheroes he'd saved had grown up to become heroes in their own right, and now finally, they were all home. 1 year after their reunion at the convention center, the little coffee shop with the blue awning on Pine Street had become their Sunday morning tradition. David and June would arrive first, ordering their usual black coffee for him, chamomile tea for her. Andy and Amy would join them shortly after, always together, always carrying their laptops and bright smiles. This particular Sunday was special, exactly 1 year since they had found each other again. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on their favorite corner table. Amy had just returned from a successful screening of her documentary, The Night We Were Saved, at a local film festival. The story of their rescue and reunion had touched hearts across the Pacific Northwest. "Remember when we discovered we'd been living just blocks apart?" Andy laughed, stirring his coffee. He had moved his software company's office to be closer to their weekly meetup spot. "I used to jog past your house every morning, never knowing you were inside." David shook his head in amazement. "Life has a funny way of keeping us close, even when we don't realize it." He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a wrapped package. "June and I have something for you both." Inside were 2 leather-bound photo albums, carefully crafted and filled with memories. The first pages showed newspaper clippings from the fire, but these weren't the faded copies they'd kept all these years. They were pristine originals June had tracked down from the newspaper archives. "Keep going," she encouraged, watching their faces as they turned the pages. There were photos none of them had seen before. David in his firefighter uniform before the rescue, the twins in their hospital beds, June reading stories to them. Then came the gaps, 30 years of separate lives captured in parallel. David and June's move to Portland, their work with fire safety education, the programs they developed for schools. Alongside these were photos Amy and Andy had shared of their lives growing up, school graduations, foster families, college days, first jobs. The final pages showed their reunion and the year that followed. Sunday coffee meetings, holiday celebrations, casual dinners at each other's homes. The four of them had woven their lives together so naturally, it was hard to remember they'd ever been apart. "There's room for more," June said softly, pointing to the blank pages at the end. "Many more years of memories to come." The coffee shop had become more than just their meeting place. It was where Andy had first shown David the latest version of his emergency response software, now being tested by fire departments across the country. It was where Amy had interviewed them all for her documentary, capturing their story with the sensitivity and depth it deserved. David had retired from his consulting business, but he hadn't slowed down. Instead, he volunteered with Andy's company, offering his expertise to make the software more practical for firefighters on the ground. His experience from that night 30 years ago was still saving lives, now through technology he could never have imagined back then. June had started a reading program at the local children's hospital, inspired by her days reading to the twins. Amy often joined her, sharing stories with young patients and their families. They had learned that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness, like reading a story to a scared child, could have ripple effects that lasted decades. "You know what's remarkable?" Amy said, closing her photo album gently. "That night could have left us with nothing but trauma and loss. Instead, it gave us something extraordinary. It gave us more family." The word family hung in the air, full of meaning. They had all felt it, growing stronger over the past year. The holidays spent together, the weekly dinners, the late-night phone calls sharing good news or seeking comfort. They had built something precious out of tragedy, something that went beyond blood ties or legal documents.